Another Chinese policy is hurting the world. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy, it's disrupting supply chains, and along with the war in Ukraine, it's putting a lot of pressure on economies the world over. Inflation is setting new records. And here in Japan, it's no different, except that record is still pretty low. Japan has always been stuck with deflationary pressures, not inflationary. So much so that the Central Bank of Japan has been actively looking for higher inflation. You heard it right, and I know it sounds strange, but our next report will decode Japan's strange but long-standing financial policy where the government pushes for higher inflation. Our second day in Tokyo, and we wake up to this headline. Bank of Japan under pressure over inflation fears. Our first reaction was normal. Inflation is rising everywhere, so why not in Japan? But a few lines in, the article threw a curveball. Turns out Japan's record inflation is just 2%. Most countries would love 2% inflation. In America, it's 8.5%. In Britain, it's 9%. And in India, it's 7.8%. But then again, Japan is not like most countries. This is where the magic happens. This is the Bank of Japan, and it has a very interesting story and history. While the world over, central banks are working to hike interest rates to contain inflation, in Japan, the central bank has decided to keep interest rates stable, even if that means higher inflation. In fact, they're actively pursuing higher inflation in a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And the logic behind that is also very interesting. How do most companies respond to inflation? If raw materials are more expensive, they charge you more. They pin the inflation on you, the consumer. But not in Japan. Here, companies fear public backlash. So instead of raising prices, they cut down costs. In simple words, pay cuts. Workers in Japan are too docile to protest such decisions. Hikes, pay cuts, extra hours, most workers have the same reaction to all of it. So inflation in Japan triggers a weird chain reaction, one that ends with less money in your pocket, which means inflation ends with deflation. For decades, Japan has tried to correct this. Central banks kept interests low. Companies were urged to hike wages, but no luck. Japan's inflation remained stagnant, and along with it, Japanese wages. 2022 has finally granted Japan's long wish. Inflation has topped 2%. But as they say, be careful what you wish for. Because Japan may have wanted higher inflation, but not this kind. Japan's economy depends on exports, mostly cars and technology, and a big chunk of that goes to China. But Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has meant bad news for Japanese exports. Just to give you an idea, in the first quarter of this year, Japanese exports to China have dropped by 22%. Then you have the US-backed sanctions against Russia. Japan has joined them. And that decision has come at a cost. The Japanese economy has shrunk by 1% in the first quarter. Another contraction, and the world's third largest economy will officially be in recession. The forecast is not good. Fuel and food prices are driving this inflation. If wages do not rise, Japanese families will find it hard to survive. But the central bank still won't budge. Their interest rates are still at near zero levels. And they have a justification too. Forced savings. That's what Japan is banking on. During the pandemic years, people cut down on spending. The hope is that money is saved up. By some estimates, Japan's forced savings could be around $156 billion. Should be enough to survive the war. But by then, Japan's economic recovery could stall. An aging population, tight Wuhan virus curbs, and falling exports. The perfect ingredients for a recession. With the WION team in Tokyo, this is Palki Sharma Upadhyay. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.